Can be opening up to Genesis 47. Actually, open to chapter 46, if you would, I think. Review a little bit before we start, kind of find our place, and pick up from chapter 46. There's something in there especially I want to note in just a minute, as it does, I think, kind of govern what's going to happen in these last 5 chapters, or how we're meaning to see this in a way. So be opening up to Genesis 46. We'll pick up there in just a moment. We're looking at the life of Jacob, as we've been doing for several months now, and are finding ourselves towards the very end of his life. Joseph is responsible for bringing all of the family to Egypt now. Jacob is going to make the journey there in chapter 46 that we're looking at. And the family is all being reunited. We're getting very close to the end of this major chapter in Israel's life and God's people's lives. So we'll pick up in chapter 46 here in a second. Let's begin with a prayer before we get any further. I invite you to bow with me. Holy God, we give you thanks for the good day you've given. Grateful for the opportunities that we've had and many, many blessings that you have provided to each one of us. Pray tonight that it help us to see clearly as we look at your word together. Give us wisdom, understanding, that we can have greater appreciation for what you have done in the lives of our forefathers in the faith. We're grateful for all that you have done, beginning with them, beginning, in fact, before them. We are thankful that through them and through those of faith, you have brought about these incredible promises, have completely fulfilled all that you spoke. That has resulted in the opportunity that we now have, assurance that we can now have of our salvation. We're thankful that you are faithful, that you reward those who seek you in faith. We pray tonight that you would be with us, that our worship would please you, that you would strengthen and equip us to do what we need to in this life. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, the main thing I wanted to recall our attention to, or one of the main things from chapter 46, was from that very first phrase. We talked about that last week. This idea of Israel journeying onward. New King James says he took his journey, but the sense is of a continuation. This phrase and these kinds of phrases are used usually in the middle of a travelogue, in the middle of telling us, oh, he went so-and-so, and he stopped there, and then he went onward this next day and continued journeying. This is an interesting time to use that phrase, and I think it's entirely thematic. I think the writer is telling us here that what we see in these next few chapters, really, I think kind of in the remainder of the book, is a continuation of this journeying of Jacob, of Israel, who used to be very nomadic, as Abraham and Isaac were. He's been kind of settled down for a long time, so far as we know. They've gotten more and more permanent in the land that they're in. But their original call, going all the way back to Genesis 12, was to be wanderers, to go where they were told to go, to follow God, and to listen to him, to do that in faith. Everything you read about that afterward, from Genesis 12 onward, all of these things that concern Abraham and his family, in their highest points, they are stories of faith. They are stories of people who have confidence in God, and their actions, hopefully and at times, reflect that. What they do best, they do by faith. And so that's what we'll find, I think, in these closing 5 chapters, is a return to that major theme of the faith of the patriarchs, the faith of Abraham, and the journeying that entails. They go about, and as 46 reveals, I've mentioned there as well, those kind of two items that you find occurring, beginning with Abraham. You see with regularity the tent and the altar, the impermanent nature of their physical lives and their physical dwellings, and then a really much more permanent and stronger thing that is made to worship God. But they build or erect both of these everywhere they go. And Jacob is getting back to that pattern in chapter 46. He's journeying onward and he's worshiping God. All these other callbacks, we saw verse 2, Jacob, Jacob, here I am. That recalls Abraham, Abraham, here I am, when he called to sacrifice Isaac. So we see him being given that reassurance by God again. Go to Egypt. Go meet with your son again. You're going to see him. The journey's going to go fine. You'll be there with him, and it'll stay that way until you're dead. And Jacob, by this point, thinks that he is very close to dying, and he's been talking that way for a long time. He's been talking that way for 20 years now, and he's got 17 years left, as it turns out. But he is physically weaker and is very aware of his own mortality. But God tells him it's all going to go well. You need to just go ahead and go, and it will all be taken care of. We get a sense of their prosperity and how God has blessed the family. There are 70 of them. Roughly, I think I would say roughly 70 of them who make this trip to Egypt, Jacob and all his household. And so they come and are going to start settling in Goshen, beginning in verse 28. They have this great reunion, Jacob and Joseph do, and then going to be meeting with Pharaoh. Really, beginning in verse 28, you have an event, or just kind of a series of events that follows into the main part of chapter 47 as well. This is all dealing with where's the family of Israel, the family of Jacob, going to live? Where actually are they going to settle in Egypt? And we've talked a little bit about the importance of that as far as kind of keeping them distinct. So we'll see some of that coming into chapter 47 as well. These are herdsmen. These are people who want to take care of the livestock and take care of the animals. And I've seen Jacob giving a lot of attention to that during his life and career. So that's going to continue. The end of chapter 46 tells us apparently this is something that was an abomination to the Egyptians, not meaning that they didn't do that themselves, or that this was an occupation that was unknown to them. And so, it was forbidden for an Egyptian to do this. It was just looked down upon them by the kind of upper class. You just had some class stratification. So someone that Joseph would be running in circles with, for instance, he would look on with a little disdain at a shepherd or a goat herder or something like that. Would just be someone of a lower class to him. So the feeling is, if we stay out here in Goshen with the animals, do what we've been doing for our whole lives, then we're not going to end up kind of like Joseph, sort of integrated into the kingdom of Egypt. We're not going to be marrying priests' daughters like he is. We're not going to be adopted into the royal court. We need to remain separate. We want to stay out here by ourselves. That's what will end up happening in the passage of time, of course. All right, anything else to mention? Comments, questions, anything to address on chapter 46 before we go on kind of getting into new stuff? I just wanted to remind ourselves of that framework first. Karen. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kind of created a lot of inventive solutions over the years, I guess, some of those problems that would come with that. But yeah, this land of Goshen is up in that northern region, up as Gary mentions up there in the Nile River Delta towards the Mediterranean. It is a little bit difficult to know maybe just kind of how that land was perceived or was exactly being used at this time. A little bit later on, or maybe in this passage even, it'll also be referred to as Ramses, just kind of that area or that region around a city, maybe known as Ramses. That would have been adopted later. Goshen, it seems, is the older name for it. But it definitely does seem to have that designation as it's used for pasture, for livestock. And so Pharaoh is already using it for that purpose. The Israelites are going to want to practice the same. All right, again, really that's kind of the discussion that we're continuing in chapter 47, is Joseph wanting to make all of this official. That's his plan, that his family will live up there in Goshen, but we need to go talk to Pharaoh and make sure he's on board with this. He takes 5 men in verse 2, 5 men from among his brothers to present to Pharaoh. It uses a verb that has to do with him picking them, kind of taking his pick among them. I don't know if this was based on, well, Simeon, you're a hothead. I'm not going to bring you. Issachar, you need to shave. We're not going to be able to bring you. Maybe get somebody who's more presentable. I don't know what the basis was for the 5 men. Maybe just kind of a representative group that he's going to take to have this interview of sorts with Pharaoh. And I don't know exactly why Joseph felt the need to coach them for this, other than maybe this just being Joseph's plan for how they need to operate in Egypt. And maybe that's reflecting how God wanted them to operate in Egypt, that they would maintain that kind of separation. Pharaoh, it seems from the beginning, has been willing to do really whatever they want. I mean, you remember his reaction when he found out that these guys were Joseph's family and that his dad was still back there in Canaan. He says, great, go get them. We'll send carts. We'll send pack animals, and you guys load everything up and bring them here, and this will all be wonderful. I mean, Pharaoh seemed very enthusiastic and very excited about getting everyone back together again and bringing them here. So it doesn't seem like he's really going to turn them down no matter what they do. But they make the offer, and he says in verse 6, essentially, you guys have the run of the land. I mean, I trust Joseph implicitly by this point, and so you guys take the best land. You want Goshen. That sounds great. If you see people who seem like they know what they're doing, set them up in position of authority too. He's kind of putting them in an administrative role in verse 6. So that all just seems like it's going to go well. And again, it ends up going well, as we'll see in their lifetimes at least. Beginning in verse 7, though, you have the next kind of interesting idea where Joseph brings in his father Jacob and sets him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. All right, what's going on in verse 7? Why is that interesting? Why is that surprising with this meeting between Jacob and Pharaoh? Yeah, Ron? With Jacob. Okay. And we saw that being promised back in chapter 46. Everything that God had said was going to happen so far has. Journey's been completed successfully, and maybe we're going to see Jacob acting on some other things that he knew to be necessary from this point on. I'm not sure. We talked about this with Abraham, and we've discussed it in some other contexts as well. This whole idea of blessing someone and the relationship, or just kind of the relative status that implies, or that confers upon people. Who blesses who? If you have two people not on equal footing, who's giving the blessing to someone else? The superior, the greater, blesses the lesser. I mentioned Abraham. That's Melchizedek, is what the Hebrews writer refers to and kind of calls back on that example talk about the priesthood of Melchizedek that was in some way making him greater than, more elevated than Abraham himself, because Melchizedek gives the blessing and Abraham gives the tithe. The money goes up and the blessing goes down. That's kind of the order of things. Well, this is a kind of a shocking thing then, isn't it? Maybe, I mean, I don't think Joseph felt this way. It's difficult to read this, not through modern eyes. I can picture myself being embarrassed almost if something like this is happening. You're bringing your dad in to meet Pharaoh, and he blesses Pharaoh. Dad, this is the most powerful guy in the world. This is the Pharaoh of Egypt. This is numero uno. This is the guy, and you're acting like you're his superior. You're pronouncing a blessing upon him. But Jacob's perspective, probably from Joseph's perspective, that's why I said I don't think he would actually be embarrassed by something like that. These are equals at the least, aren't they? This is Jacob who has a direct pronouncement from God of his favor for him, and that he is going to be, through Abraham, the progenitor of this great and mighty nation, just as Pharaoh is the leader of a mighty nation. As he's seeing it, really, these are two heads of state that are getting together. And Pharaoh does not seem to take offense to it at all either. Brother Ellis. Right. Yeah. They mention in their records they saw the ideal life as 110 years would be. Yeah. 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 And as we'll see, that's where Pharaoh's kind of goes immediately in this meeting. How old are you? And seems to show some respect for that, and again, seems to receive this without any kind of, hang on a sec, buddy. I'm the Pharaoh. What do you think? What do you think you're doing? What are you trying to imply here? It's received in the manner in which it's offered. Again. Yeah. Yeah. You have a regime change coming, don't you? Yeah. Yeah. And again, it is difficult to know, how old is this man at this time? Maybe a young man. We've seen some things that would maybe lead us to infer that he is a younger man, a less experienced man. But something about this, just to all parties involved, seems fit. It seems appropriate that Jacob should bless Pharaoh upon meeting him. Really, it's pretty impressive that everyone does see the fitness in this, the rightness in Pharaoh showing respect and showing a degree of reverence to Jacob, the great patriarch who has been blessed by God in so many things, is coming with his own. He's not coming with an army at his back, but he's coming with a large family. He's coming with the kernel, the seed of a nation. And so they begin to discuss some things there in verse 8. The two things there, of course, that are revealed. How old are you? Jacob says, the years of my pilgrimage, and there's again the idea of him journeying, the sojourn of the patriarch. The years of my pilgrimage are 130. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. They've not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. So Jacob's view of his life, I don't want to be too critical of it. He's 130 years old. He has been blessed by God. He's been enormously wealthy and prosperous and all these sorts of things. I mean, he's been taken care of through a lot of difficulties, some of them of his own making, some of them he is a victim in them. He's lived an eventful life, a very human life, ups and downs and troughs and crests, all those sorts of things. But his view of that is, keep in mind, again, this is a guy who thinks he's about to die at any moment. I haven't lived a very long life relative to dad and granddad and whoever else. And it's been a challenge. Few and evil. They've been bad years. They've been hard years. That's 130 years of tough living with bad breaks. I mean, it just gives insight into who Jacob is. Again, I won't say he's, bad for thinking this way or that he should think this way. It's just how he sees it. You can understand some of it, the loss that he's felt, especially around Joseph and that whole part of his family, kind of, with Rachel dying, Joseph being presumed dead, and then all of this fear that he has over something happening to Benjamin. I mean, that's really kind of governed who he is. All of that worry with Esau and the wrestling that the first part of his life was comprised of, that struggling and wrestling with men and with angels. Jacob has, in many ways, lived a challenging life. I would say it has been a long one, but he says it's been a challenge. It's been a fight the entire time, and that's how he's depicted from the moment he's born. Grabbing onto his brother's heel, he's fighting from the womb. I mean, he's been struggling for literally almost his entire life. So he reveals some of that to Pharaoh and blesses him, and then that audience is over, and we kind of move on after having gotten that insight into who Jacob is and really who he sees himself as. Comments, questions, anything to talk about with this meeting there between Jacob and all right, beginning in verse 11 then, you're going to see Joseph making the provisions for family as we hoped and as things were set up. All of that just is going to go off without a hitch. I don't want to spend a lot of time really on verses 13 through 26. Not to say that they're unimportant. I do want to get back to this idea of Jacob in Egypt. Verses 13 through 26, we can summarize, as I've summarized there in just that kind of one phrase, one sentence. They're just telling us about Joseph's continued wisdom and his continued sort of skillful administration in the role that Pharaoh has put him in. We're going to just see what's going on in the rest of Egypt. Because although we're starting to get to sort of happy ending type feeling, and we've got great reunions, and we've got all these things going on, and it seems like it's all positive everywhere, bear in mind, you've still got years left of famine. We were in the middle of, when all this started, we were 2 years into 7 years of nothing, of famine, that's going to be not only in Egypt, but apparently everywhere else within striking distance of Egypt. So you have a lot of people who are going hungry, a lot of people who are on hard times, and are going to be facing that for the next several years. So really, those 14 verses are just dealing with that. There's no bread in all the land. The famine was severe. Egypt and Canaan both languish because of the famine. The difference is Egypt is prepared because they've got Joseph and because God has blessed them through him. And so you're just going to read about people coming to Joseph, needing food, and through that process, he is going to consolidate power for the Egyptian monarchy, really, is what he's doing. Again, reading it through a modern lens, I think it would probably be the majority opinion of most people reading this today in 21st century America. Joseph is the bad guy in this story. He's helping the government. He's helping a king, first of all. I thought we got rid of kings in America. He's helping the king get more power. He's kind of instituting feudalism into the world. This isn't something that you want to see happen. You're making more people reliant on the goodwill of Pharaoh. That's not a positive whatsoever. The point of this really seems to be just to show us Joseph is doing his job well. He's doing his job wisely. And if that is going to be exercised by a good king, which Pharaoh really to this point has shown himself to be, he's shown reverence for God's people. He's shown an ability when God reveals something to say, okay, if that's the way it's got to be, then you tell me what to do and I'll do it. He is in many ways the best king you'll find in the Old Testament, almost. Definitely up until the time of David. He's going to be far better than anyone else you would read of or see anywhere else. So if this is administrated by a good king, then those people who are his servants are going to prosper. They're going to continue to have food. They're going to continue to have their needs met. They're going to continue to just go as his fortunes go. But again, the main point seems to be just telling us Joseph does well. He executes wisely in this task. That could be, or maybe again, depending on the times, maybe this is how you end up having treasure cities. If you have everyone else bringing you all of their wares, bringing you all the anything valuable that isn't food, essentially, Egypt is going to acquire through this process. And in turn, they're going to pay out the food that these people they get land, other materials, raw materials. And now they get a kind of favorable deal for the future with this tax that's levied against. It also just serves to explain that practice as well, which is attested in Egypt at the time, beginning there in verse 24, that 1/5 tax. This serves to explain that. 5 is the big number for chapter 47, by the way. Really kind of this little mini section of Genesis. Almost any time you see a number, it deals with 5. Interesting how Genesis focuses on one number and use it over and over for a while, and then on to a new number. 5 is the order right now. All right. Again, I didn't want to just spend a ton of time in that. Let's get back to what's going on with Jacob, because now we are told in verse 27, they're prospering. Israel is prospering. Jacob is going to live there for 17 years. We mentioned last week the symmetry, the significance of that. Joseph is taken away from Jacob when he's 17 years old, and now they're reunited for these final 17 years of Jacob's life. So the book-ending 17 years where they are together. And now verse 29, again, I know it keeps happening. It's like the last Lord of the Rings movie, where it ends like 20 times. We keep seeing Jacob is about to die. He's on his deathbed. He's getting close to the end. And then, 17 years later, here's this thing that happens. He's been talking about it forever. And the scripture's even been talking about it forever. It's just painting this idea of impending death, but he just keeps on lingering. But now we're serious, okay? I promise. It's really about to happen. The time drew near that Israel must die, verse 29 tells us. So he has a request. What, at this moment in time, is the key thing for Joseph to do afterward? Okay, take my bones, take any remains that you can find, take my bones back to Canaan and bury me with my fathers. That idea of resting with their fathers is a phrase you find a lot of times in the Old Testament. It's metaphorical. A lot of times it just talks about someone dying and being buried. Jacob wants that to be as literal as possible. You bury me with my fathers. You bury me in the place where they are. And he does not want to be buried in Egypt. What? Why? Why does he want this? And why is it important? What does it matter? Or does it? Maybe you're saying, I don't think it does. What's he talking about? Ian? Okay. okay, this idea of the place I will show you, as Ian points out, has been important for the last 33 chapters now, going back to Abraham, Genesis 12. This matters, this place that God is showing them and that he has carved out for them, that he told Abraham, you walk the length and breadth of it. You check it out. You take a look at the perimeter to see that I'm not giving you a bad deal. You look at this land and it's yours, and it's your descendants afterward. And they possess it in these very limited means, this kind of trickle of increasing possession of it that they get. You know, Abraham buys enough land to bury his wife. And then Isaac maybe acquires a little bit more of a foothold. And then Jacob builds a little bit more of a permanent situation there. And then all of that gets kind of a train wreck in the middle of it because now the whole family is gone. We're moving down to Egypt. We're moving backwards. This is bad. We're supposed to take possession of the land. Jacob realizes this, it seems, in some way and says, okay, this isn't where it stops. We're not meant to be in Egypt. When I'm done, you take me back home. You take me back to Canaan, back to the land that God promised, and that's where you bury me. Not here in Egypt, because I don't belong here. This idea, and by the way, Joseph, we're moving forward a little bit, Joseph says, I like this idea. Dad was onto something. This is a good idea. Do the same thing for me. When you guys leave Egypt to go back to Israel, and he's even looking at it as saying, I know this is going to happen, that all of you are going to be going back sometime to Canaan. When that happens, you take me and you bury me in Canaan, not here in Egypt. And here's a guy who maybe could have had his own pyramid, who knows? But he's saying, I don't care about any of that. Take me to Canaan. Jacob is of this mind. We can't look at it without thinking of Hebrews 11. And really that's, Mark, keep your finger there in Genesis 48. I'm going to get back to it in a minute. But Hebrews 11, really this upcoming account deals a lot with this. And I think Ian was right to point out kind of those thematic parallels when we think of ourselves as Christians. This entire era of patriarchs that, as we've mentioned, the Genesis idea is so invested in their faith. And Paul, when he's preaching the gospel in Romans especially, and he's telling anybody what faith means, he always goes back to Abraham. That's always the guy you start with. But this whole era of men, the Hebrews writer, in his great chapter on faith, he summarizes them with 6 verses. All four of these men, all of these generations, they get 6 verses and just kind of one little thing each that talks about their faith. But this idea is half of that, really. It's Joseph's act of faith in verse 22, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. You'd say that same would apply to what Jacob is doing here now. I know God has promised this. He's going to put us there, and I want to be a part of it. Jacob has that idea too. Verse 21 is what Jacob is about to do in our text in chapter 48. He's going to bless the sons of Joseph and worship God, leaning on the top of his staff when he's dying. We'll talk in a little bit about why that's an act of faith. But that's something that should resonate with us, I guess, and that should be this similar mindset that I'm living here in this place, but this is not where I belong. This is not what God has in mind for me as the end. This is not where I want the true end for me to be. After this, I'm going somewhere else. And so you need to take me there, is what Jacob is telling Joseph. Joseph tells his sons. We thankfully don't have to do that. We don't have to make funeral arrangements that ensure that God's promise is kept in that way, because we live and die in faith. If we live and die in faith in that same way, we're saying the same thing. Here's where I am, but it's not where I belong. I'm going somewhere else. So after I die, that's where I'll be. That's what we see in their best moments from Jacob and his family. So he wants to be carried out of Egypt and go to the place where he really and truly belongs. Comments, questions, anything else to mention on that idea? Deathbed request. And that, yeah. And that is the idea kind of running underneath that, I guess, the undercurrent of all of this is God is faithful. We're faithful in him because he is faithful to his word. And so that's the land he promised. That's the land we're going to have. I don't care if we're not there right now. I don't care if I die here. I don't care if you die here. That's home because God said so. That's the implication in all. So the other idea there is him bowing himself on the head of his bed. The New King James says that really seems like it should be staff. It's translated that way in a lot of different translations or manuscripts or what have you, and it's how the Hebrews writer talks about it, of him leaning on his staff. A lot of discussion that could be had over that, but the idea again seems to be a thematic one. Jacob has called attention at times to his staff, and it's this walking implement. It's this thing that you need on a journey, that you need on a sojourn, and he is even in this kind of weakened state, now needing it to simply stand almost. He is still bowing and worshiping to God, and making some other plans or some other provisions for the near future, even ones that do not concern. That's what chapter 48 is going to get to. We finally get the news from someone else. It's been either the narrator or Jacob telling us this whole time, I'm about to die. Finally, we get a third party who can verify, yes, he's ill. It's really about to happen. You should come see him, Joseph. So Joseph goes to visit Jacob as the end is drawing nearer. As we mentioned, this is the episode that out of Jacob's whole life, out of this entire career that goes back 130 years and many, many chapters in Genesis, this is what the Hebrews writer says, by faith, Jacob did this. And it's going to be this act of passing on the blessing to the sons of Joseph. This is a surprising decision that we're going to see him making. I'm going to try to move a little bit quickly through this. He tells Joseph of some of the facts of his life, kind of walks him back through the key events maybe in his life, and talks a little bit about the land and the promise that God made to him concerning this land and this family that God was going to make of them. He was going to multiply his descendants and make them into this huge and mighty people. And then he tells Joseph, now your two boys, verse 5, Ephraim and Manasseh. Who's the firstborn out of these? Manasseh, firstborn. Who's mentioned first? Ephraim, secondborn. Foreshadowing, we're about to see why this is important. Usually, and we still do it today, usually it's, older brother is named first or whatever it is. But here, Ephraim is already taking precedence in Jacob's mind. It says, those two sons are mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. He's identifying them as his two firstborn. Now, he does not say clearly or explicitly here, I'm disowning Reuben and Simeon. Those two guys are lousy. So Reuben slept with his stepmom, essentially, slept with a concubine, and Simeon massacred an entire town. Those two guys are crazy. I'm disowning them, and I'm going to take your two boys instead. That isn't what he does. Maybe it's on his mind. I don't know. When he talks about Reuben and Simeon in chapter 49, he's going to essentially say, I don't know about these. I don't know what happened with them. But for right now, he is conveniently using them, those two firstborn, to say to Joseph, that's what Ephraim and Manasseh are going to be like. Their inheritance will be akin to what the first two sons of mine have. Normally, of course, if you think of what kind of inheritance would Ephraim and Manasseh get from Jacob, much less than that, because they would get their share of Joseph's share, which is a 12th of the whole. And so they're really being bumped up in the order. They're moving up a generation. Jacob is doing something that shows preference for them, that shows his affection for Joseph but that shows his desire to bless them. The reasoning for this, why does this happen? You get in verse 7, what almost sounds like, kind of sounds like an old man rambling at first almost. It sounds like a kind of a wistful non sequitur. He's talking about his life and, I'm going to bless your sons. And then he goes and starts talking about his dead wife again. Starts reminiscing about how Rachel died. It doesn't immediately seem to fit maybe in this yarn that he's spinning for Joseph. But when you really think about it, it does make sense for him to talk about his wife dying and him having to bury her. Why do this? Why show this favor for Joseph? Because this has always been his favored branch of the family. Rachel was his favorite of his 4 wives, and she had Joseph, his favorite son. She had Benjamin, his second favorite son, and the favorite for the last 25 years when Joseph was presumed dead. And then she died, having Benjamin. Did not have the chance to have more children, did not have the chance to have more heirs added to that kind of favored branch. So now he's sort of repairing that. These 2 that are her grandsons, they're going to kind of take the place that was stripped away because of her untimely death. Seems to be the way that thought line is going. Now, you have interesting things start happening when Israel or Jacob is actually going to provide the blessing. We get a detail given in verse 10 that his eyes were dim with age so that he could not see. And he asks in verse 8, seemingly because of that, his eyesight is not what it was. The boys are there. He's not like pitch black blind, like he has his eyes closed. He just can't see very well at all, it seems. Everything is very dim. Everything is cloudy. So he asked Joseph, who are these two young guys here, wanting to kind of confirm these are his sons. Why is this interesting, or what does this remind us of? How did Jacob get his blessing? It was from a blind guy. It was from somebody who, when you approach him, he says, who is that? And he's got to start feeling for something so that he knows what's going on. Maybe the reason this is by faith Jacob did this, in the Hebrews writer opinion. Again, we kind of get to the point of asking, what about this shows faith that he blessed these 2 sons and adopted them as his own? Maybe it is just this. It's differences with that kind of bungled blessing that you had given by Isaac. Blind Isaac, who ends up being tricked into, who Jacob feels like he has to trick into giving him the blessing, even though God had already said, Isaac's, Jacob, he's the one, the younger shall be head of the older, so forth. Maybe the difficulty and the turmoil and all that. Now the difference with Jacob simply saying, I'm taking the one that we want, that God wants, evidently, Ephraim, and I'll give him the blessing and, the kind of first priority as firstborn. I'm going to confer on him the blessing of the firstborn, and Manasseh has to sort of stand by and watch. But there's no turmoil in this idea. There's no deception. There's no hurt feelings. There's no controversy about any of this. It seems to be simply a man acting by faith in what he's meant to do, and highlights Israel's confidence in God's ways at this stage in his life, that he will simply go along with the plan. The fact that he speaks of Israel in national terms throughout this chapter seems to confirm that idea as well, that he maintains that belief in God's promise that through these boys, Israel will continue to grow, and they will be great just as the rest of the nation will be great. Did the bell ring? Okay. I'm going to have to stop there then, and I'll let you all stop listening to. We'll pick up in chapter 48 next week. There's a little bit more that we can get to there, and we'll kind of clarify some of that. And then next week, we're going to try to get through to the very end and go ahead and wrap up the life of Jacob and going from chapter 48 to 50. We'll attempt that next week. Hope that you'll all be here for it. Thank you very much. Always appreciate your time.